Soldiers take a solemn oath to protect our nation, and we have a solemn responsibility to send them into battle with clear and achievable missions. Senator Jack Reed, State of Rhode Island.
Welcome back to Inside Iraq. To put the joint Petraeus-Crocker testimony in perspective, I am now joined from Washington by Stephen Livingston, a professor of media and international affairs at George Washington University. Professor Livingston, the testimony by General Petraeus, was it a pure military testimony stemming from events on the ground, or did it have a political tinge to it?
It was a military testimony that was given in a very political context, and so therefore it couldn't help but be political in its consequence. General Petraeus, I'm sure, is an honorable man who has a particular mission, and he also has several audiences that he was talking to when he was giving his testimony. His men and women in uniform in Iraq, the congressmen and senators before him, but also there was a public element too, because certainly the American public were paying very close attention to what he was having to say. And so, as I said, it is inevitably a very political series of statements as well.
It was billed as one of the most important testimony before Congress, perhaps not since 1967, when General Westmoreland testified in the height of the Vietnam War. And now General Petraeus, was in the spotlight. In your opinion, was he able, or will he be able, to stem the tide of defection in the Republican camp?
Well, he was able to do so in the past vote, having to do with Senator Webb's proposal, his proposal to put limitations as to the amount of time that U.S. troops can be deployed to Iraq without sufficient rest time outside of the theater of operation, outside of the war. In a subsequent vote, the Senate failed to reach the 60 votes that were needed in order to sustain Senator Webb's proposal. So the Republican plan to remain in Iraq, the position where we are going to continue with pretty much the status quo, has succeeded. So if General Petraeus' testimony had an effect, that was the immediate effect of that testimony.
An honorable man, a scholar and a soldier at the same time, and yet he was made of political football in Washington.
Four-star general, a PhD from Princeton University. He has a remarkable pedigree, but the forces, the level of tension in this country, the consequences of that are unraveling with this war, not only for the Iraqis, but also for the American public, really puts a lot of pressure on an individual man. It's interesting, too, that Ambassador Crocker, also a very distinguished American diplomat, was pretty much overshadowed by this. This was the General Petraeus show, not the Ambassador Crocker Petraeus show. So all of that focus, all of that energy was focused right on General Petraeus, and he has been made a very political football, but it's important for us to keep in mind that in the view of the critics in this country, it was the Bush administration, in a very dangerous fashion, quite frankly, that made General Petraeus the political football. And they've done so by asking a four-star general to essentially come out and be the mouthpiece for the Bush administration's war plans in Iraq.
Listening to the testimony over 2 days, first in the House of Representatives and then later on in the Senate, you could pretty much see that it was polarized. The Republicans, they would give him the benefit of the doubt, while the Democrats, they were, came out swinging, especially Representative Lantos when he told him, "General, I really don't buy it."
Right. Well, the entire war, though, has become politicized. And I think after this vote that I've just referred to, where the best effort on the part of the Democrats in the Senate to find a means of compromising with the Republicans, with the Republican colleagues, failed, and it failed by a considerable margin of reaching that necessary vote. This, I think, afterwards, the analysis is indicating this has left the Democrats in a position of simply staking out more clearly, as best as they can, the idea that they are opposed to the status quo in Iraq, leaving the Republicans to own the war. I mean, I think really in the long term, the political consequence of events in the last week is that it's been very, very clearly articulated that this is the Republicans' war. They own it. And it looks to be a very broken war, a very broken circumstance. And so it's going to be very interesting how this plays out with the next elections.
Well, before the next election, yes, indeed it is. Before the next election, the general is expected to come back again in March. Every 6 months, Congress wants to hear from him. And events on the ground, one way or another, was going to dictate the political scene in Washington, D.C. If then in the next 6 months that violence is not stemmed completely, what do you think the consequences would be for the White House as well as for Congress?
Yeah, I think for the Republicans in Congress and for the White House, they're going to have a very difficult time managing the perceptions that they've quite frankly been remarkably successful in managing. And I'm really emphasizing, drawing our attention to the idea of managing perceptions. Going into General Petraeus' testimony, there were a number of reports, the Congressional the
General
GAO,
Accounting Office, yes.
The National Intelligence Estimate that was released in August of 2007, another independent commission chaired by General Jim Jones looking into the abilities of the Iraqi security forces. All three of those reports clearly indicated that at best there was mixed success because of the surge. Most of them came to a fairly pessimistic conclusion. If you look at some of the hard indicators of violent deaths, certainly the percentage, for instance, of deaths in Baghdad have remained pretty much flat. The numbers have gone down, but the relative percentage of deaths in Baghdad have remained pretty much the same from before the surge. The number of deaths outside of Baghdad have increased. The number of American soldiers killed has increased. So all of these indicators, even going into this testimony, were not exactly rosy. The administration was able to keep control of the perceptions to a degree, but as you say, as we continue on into March, into subsequent timeframes, it's going to be more and more challenging for this administration to actually succeed in shaping a picture that's going to be to their benefit.
When would the tipping point comes for the Republicans? Up to here or no more, Mr. President? Otherwise, you know, it's our seats is on the line, and you have to pull the majority of the American forces out. When will that come? Before the convention?
That's hard to say. Perhaps. I mean, we're going to have to see how the polling data for key Republican races, particularly in the Senate, where there's a significant number of Republican senators up for re-election. And as we draw closer to the elections, quite frankly, and I don't mean this to sound cynical, but thinking through it in an analytical fashion, the numbers that may push it are not the deaths in Iraq, but the polling data in various congressional races here in the United States, as senators who are running for re-election, or as the presidential candidates from the Republican Party appear to not find or coalesce around a single candidate. There's going to be more and more political pressure put on the Republican Party to put distance between itself and this administration's policies in Iraq. I think that's going to be the tipping point, and it's going to be determined by the polling data.
Professor Livingston, my last question. The one name that emerges during those 2 days of testimony is the Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. Shape up or ship out? The Americans cannot take this anymore if there is no national reconciliation. Do you think the pressure by the White House on al-Maliki will start squeezing him now?
Yes, but you know what? Maliki was able to seize on the Blackwater incident as appropriately as he should as the Iraqi leader, but he was able to seize on the Blackwater incident to push back on the administration and push back on the Americans generally and say, you know, you have to respect Iraqi laws. You talk about me and my inability to govern my own forces. Well, look, the Blackwater folks work for you, work for the Americans, and you can't control them. What's the difference between what you're asking me to do and what you yourself fail to do with your private security firms? And he was, of course, went on to underscore that the incident with the 24 or so people was not unique, that there were other instances of contractors shooting wildly. So this offered Maliki an opportunity to push back against the Americans that complicates the whole picture quite significantly.
Professor Stephen Livingston from George Washington University, thank you for being a guest on Inside Iraq.
It's been my pleasure.
My thanks to all my guests, and to watch the show online and to send us your comments, please go to aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Goodbye.